Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're your shortcut to getting truly well-informed on the big issues.
Glad to be here.
So today we're jumping right into some pretty significant news from August 2025. It's really shifting the conversation around the Ukraine conflict.
That's right.
Just recently, the German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, actually floated the idea of a, quote, shrunken Ukraine potentially joining NATO as part of a peace deal.
Mm-hmm. And that comes right after President-elect Trump met with Vladimir Putin up in Alaska August 18th.
Yeah, and the reports from that meeting suggest, well, maybe some real progress on peace talks that likely involve Ukraine giving up some territory for security guarantees.
And it's fascinating, how this links back to earlier events. Remember President Zelensky's big shift in March 2025, saying Ukraine was suddenly ready to negotiate peace.
That was a huge change, especially after that pretty fiery clash he had with Trump when he was president-elect and the pause in U.S. military aid that followed.
It really shows how fast things are moving, how the dynamics are changing on the ground.
Absolutely. And these aren't just headlines in isolation. They're really forcing a discussion, a crucial one, about America's role, Ukraine's future, NATO's future, especially through a conservative lens. You hear many conservatives calling the war in Ukraine an avoidable tragedy, and it keeps sparking this intense debate about U.S. involvement, the cost, the best way to peace.
It definitely does.
So that's our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into those varied, sometimes even conflicting conservative views on the war, on Russia, on NATO expansion. We want to explore the main arguments, the big concerns, the America First solutions being proposed.
And we'll be drawing directly from recent analyses, recent reports, trying to understand what this perspective means for America's path forward.
Right. So let's start with that phrase, avoidable tragedy. Many conservatives frame the war that way, blaming what they call incompetent or chaotic foreign policy from the Biden administration.
Yes, the core idea is that this didn't have to happen. It was, in their view, avoidable.
Okay, so if it was avoidable, looking back before the invasion, what specific things do these conservative critics point to? What were the alleged missteps?
Well, there are several key points they raise from before the fighting started. One big one was the Nord Stream 2 waiver. That was back in May 2021.
The gas pipeline from Russia to Germany.
Exactly. Biden waived U.S. sanctions on it, even though there was pushback from both parties. Critics saw that as, well, undermining efforts to stop Russia using energy as a weapon.
Okay. What else?
Then there's the whole issue of deterrence, or what they call failed deterrence. The argument is that Biden seemed maybe too weak or too cautious about arming Ukraine early on.
You mean like the minor incursion comment?
That's definitely cited, that comment from January 2022. Plus, ignoring urgent requests for more significant military aid back in the fall of 2021, all seen as signals that perhaps emboldened Putin.
And this ties into another major conservative point, right? The idea that maybe NATO itself, or talk about its expansion, played a role.
Precisely. The administration gets criticized for, as they put it, dangling NATO membership before Ukraine, and for sticking to that 2008 promise from Bucharest that Ukraine would eventually join.
The argument being that this increased Putin's paranoia.
Yes, that it fueled his concerns and contributed to him rejecting that December 2021 demand for guarantees against NATO expansion. And more broadly, some see Biden's focus on promoting democracy globally, his liberal internationalist approach, as needlessly antagonizing Russia, pushing it ultimately into a closer alliance with China, Iran, and North Korea.
Okay, so that's the picture painted before the invasion. But the criticism didn't stop once the war began, did it? How did those arguments carry forward?
No, they definitely continued, maybe even intensified. After the invasion, the critique shifted to the nature of the aid. Even though aid was eventually provided, the argument is that it was often too little too late, meaning delays and limitations on key things Ukraine needed, like long-range missiles, the ATACMS everyone talks about, or modern fighter jets MiG-29s initially, then the F-16s, which faced long delays, even the Abrams tanks. Only 31 were sent.
And this slow, cautious approach had consequences.
Critics argue this risk-averse pattern just dragged the war out, turned it into a grinding attrition conflict where Ukraine lost momentum by late 2022. Those F-16s weren't even expected until midsummer 2024, at the absolute earliest.
And strategy. Was there a clear goal?
That's another criticism. The as long as it takes line is seen as lacking a real strategy for how Ukraine could actually win or even just end the fighting. Some view it more as a proxy war, designed mainly to bleed Russia dry.
What about the diplomatic side? Was that a focus of conservative critique too?
Oh, absolutely. There's strong criticism that the Biden administration effectively shut down diplomatic channels by, publicly calling Putin a war criminal, for example.
Making talks harder.
That's the argument, that the administration did, quote, nothing to promote a ceasefire or a peace agreement, and may have even blocked attempts at negotiation when they arose.
So if that's the critique of the Biden approach, what's the proposed America First alternative? What would that look like in this situation?
Well, the core idea of America First here is prioritizing U.S. national interests above everything else. It emphasizes peace through strength, strong deterrence, but also avoiding what they call unnecessary and unending wars.
And it needs a certain kind of leader.
Proponents say it requires a competent and decisive commander-in-chief.
And former President Trump's style is often presented as the example here.
Yes, very much so. His unpredictable and unconventional style is seen by supporters as a key deterrent. The idea is that adversaries like Putin just could not be sure how Trump would respond to aggression.
What about tangible actions under Trump?
Well, they point to the fact that the Trump administration approved the first lethal military aid to Ukraine back in 2018, those Javelin anti-tank missiles. That's framed as a sign of American strength, unlike under Obama.
And his approach to NATO.
He pushed hard for NATO members to increase their defense spending to meet those targets. The goal was strengthening European deterrence, making sure allies, carry their full weight.
And with Putin himself.
Trump maintained dialogue. It was described as a transactional approach, keeping lines open, even showing some respect, to lower tensions while still defending U.S. interests.
So the underlying argument is that this kind of America First policy might have actually prevented the war.
That's exactly what advocates argue, that the invasion could have been stopped by not provoking Putin, avoiding aggressive democracy promotion campaigns aimed at Russia's neighbors, or constantly pushing for Ukraine and NATO.
Is there a specific what-if scenario they mention?
Some suggest that if the U.S. had offered, say, to delay Ukraine's NATO membership for a decade back in late 2021 or early 2022, that might have been enough to convince Putin to back down.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to something we hear a lot about, the cost. The money, the resources, the endless war critique. What are the specific conservative concerns there?
Yeah, Ukraine fatigue is real in conservative circles. There's huge concern about the sheer amount of money, insane amounts of our taxpayer money, as some put it. Over $113 billion in the first 2 years, then another $61 billion approved in April 2024.
It's a staggering amount.
It is, but it's not just the money itself. It's the impact on America's own military readiness. The argument is that sending so much equipment has depleted U.S. military stockpiles.
How badly?
Well, they point to things like Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, potentially taking 13 years to replace what we've sent, or 155mm artillery shells. The U.S. makes about 14,000 a month. But Ukraine can burn through that in just 2 days of heavy fighting. It got to the point where the Pentagon said in December 2023 that its main account for sending existing stocks was basically empty, forcing tough choices, they said.
So accountability becomes a big issue. How is that being addressed?
Well, you had former President Trump floating that idea in February 2024, make future aid a loan, maybe no interest, but still a loan, to add some accountability.
And corruption, is that part of the concern?
Yes, concerns about Ukrainian corruption and whether U.S. aid is actually being used effectively, or if some is being siphoned off, are frequently voiced.
And this also ties into the role of European allies, doesn't it? A feeling that they should be doing more.
Definitely. There's a strong critique that European nations are still hopelessly dependent on the U.S. for their security. You look at Poland, sending aid depleted their own stocks by 1/3. Shows a lack of depth.
Even with recent moves, like Germany's new Security Council.
Right. Even with things like that, the perception is still one of European hesitation and, frankly, little capacity to deploy serious forces without America leading the way.
Okay, so given all these critiques, the cost, the strategy, the burden sharing, what's the America First path towards actually ending the war? What's the push for peace look like?
A lot of conservatives see the war as a long-term stalemate now. And they argue that just continuing to pour in aid without a clear path to victory is becoming expensive virtue signaling.
So what's the alternative?
A key theme you hear is this stark choice. Ukraine can have political independence or territorial integrity, but it cannot have both.
Meaning concessions are necessary.
Exactly. The view is that any realistic peace deal will likely involve Ukraine making territorial concessions in exchange for security agreements. It's seen as unreasonable to expect Ukraine to militarily retake all of Crimea and the Donbas.
Trump has hinted at this.
He's alluded to land swaps, yeah.
Yeah.
His stated priority is ending the killing, focusing on stopping the bloodshed, rather than getting caught up in who's winning or losing.
And he feels labeling Putin a war criminal hurts that goal.
Yes, the belief is that kind of language makes a negotiated settlement much harder. So, the proposed America First strategy often includes making future military aid conditional on Ukraine actually participating in peace talks with Russia.
Using aid as leverage for talks.
Precisely. And using NATO membership as a bargaining chip, too. Offering to, say, put off NATO membership for Ukraine for an extended period is seen as a way to entice Putin to the negotiating table.
Some go further on NATO.
Some conservatives are very clear. Ukraine should not be joining NATO, ever. Full stop.
What about Zelensky's shift, his recent willingness to talk peace back in March? How is that viewed?
Well, interestingly, there's some skepticism there within conservative circles. Zelensky making that overture under Trump's strong leadership. Some see it less as a genuine change of heart and more maybe as a ploy to get back into Washington's good graces, perhaps to get the aid flowing again.
It's clear this isn't just one single viewpoint. There seems to be a range, a spectrum of conservative thought here. Can we break down the main positions?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's insightful because these different stances sort of reveal an internal debate about what America First actually means in a crisis like this. You can broadly see maybe three main camps.
Okay. What's the first?
First, you have the strict non-interventionists. Their view is basically no spending on Ukraine, it's not our problem. They focus on the cost, the risk of nuclear war, and the fact that Ukraine isn't a NATO ally, so there's no treaty obligation.
All right. Second.
Second is the push for a negotiated settlement. This is often linked with Trump. The idea is, yes, it's in America's interest to stop the war, but let's be realistic. Ukraine probably won't retake Crimea and the Donbas. So the U.S. should pressure both sides into a deal where Russia likely keeps those territories.
And the third group?
The third group sees this more through the lens of weakening Russia. Their argument is, look, Russia is a major strategic competitor. Any losses they take in Ukraine are good for the U.S. So they support robust aid. It degrades Russia's military without putting American troops at risk. They also see it as a chance to test U.S. weapons and send a message to China.
And how do all these different views connect to the bigger picture? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, that whole axis.
There's a pretty common thread of concern across most conservative viewpoints here. It's that Biden's policies, seen as hostile, have pushed Russia closer to China, Iran, and North Korea, creating this anti-U.S. axis that's challenging the global order.
Any other geopolitical takes?
Some conservatives also raise points about Ukraine's borders themselves, arguing they're kind of artificial, a relic of Soviet propaganda, and maybe inherently indefensible. They suggest adjustments might be needed to reflect, quote, solid realities for any lasting peace.
And what about Putin himself? Is there agreement on his ultimate goals, or is that debated too?
That's another area of real divergence. You have some who believe Russia poses zero direct threat to the U.S. beyond maybe nukes or cyber attacks. They think NATO would crush Russia conventionally, so the fuss over Ukraine is overblown.
But others disagree.
Oh, yeah. Others issue stark warnings. Putin won't stop. They argue his ambitions, and maybe more importantly, the ambitions of his Chinese patron, Xi Jinping, are global. From this perspective, abandoning Ukraine wouldn't just end that conflict.
It would send a signal.
It would embolden other autocrats and could even, as they put it, greenlight a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It really highlights the long-term stakes involved in these policy choices.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, really unpacking these conservative perspectives on the Ukraine conflict.
It's complex terrain.
It is. We've seen common themes emerge. Ending what's seen as an endless war, prioritizing America First ideas, focusing on fiscal responsibility instead of blank checks, and pushing for a quick, negotiated peace, even if it means tough concessions on territory.
It's fundamentally a push to base foreign policy on perceived, solid realities and direct national interests.
Yeah, a call to rethink how America engages with the world. So as you, our listener, think about all this, what solid realities do you believe the U.S. needs to prioritize in its global role? How should we balance our ideals with pragmatic outcomes to achieve peace and protect our own interests?
Definitely something to think about.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.